Um, so mostly I wanted to kind of take a look at some of the popular machine learning frameworks and peek like one layer below into the implementation, not go too deep, but just bring out the various kind of choices that these guys that they had, and what worked, what didn't work, what are the pros and cons of each thing, and how in some sense it's also a bit of a historical archaeology of this thing as well. So I I want to kind of start with like at the core of it, like an ML framework. So if you kind of peel off all of the top level layers out of like an ML framework, you mostly kind of end up with numerical computation engine, which, you know, given sort of arrays can or tensors can manipulate them in certain ways, and which, you know, your regular numpy is kind of good enough. And in fact, if you see most of the ML frameworks at the base of it, they all have a very numpy like API that you do things with. And then on top of that, you layer on an automatic differentiation engine. Like that is like the delta from NumPy that you kind of do. With roughly these things, you can throw in the ability to run on accelerators like GPUs or TPUs, but at the base of it, this is what you have. And so um, I want to start with like the slightly more interesting part, which is automatic differentiation. And most frameworks have a very similar idea of how they do automatic differentiation. If you read the literature or something like that, there are multiple ways of doing it, like theoretically, but all of the top frameworks, they all follow the same, a very, very similar approach, which is just a glorified application of the chain rule that we've all learned in high school math. So if you take sort of a function which is composed out of, say, four functions, you can write the derivative of one with respect to the other just via a chain rule, right? That's just the basics. So like if you see on the right, that's it. Now the order in which you apply this is actually not specified. Like you could actually go in whatever order you want, and the chain rule just kind of just specifies this is how you compute this thing. But what I wanted to kind of say is there are multiple ways of doing this. So you can start sort of internally. So you do, if you compute this, you end up with, you know, the derivative of b with respect to x. Then you apply this thing, you'll end up with the derivative of c with respect to x, then y with respect to x, and that's what you end up with, and that's what you want to compute. The other is to go from left to right, where you compute this for, you multiply these two first, so you'll end up with sort of y over the y with respect to b, then with respect to a, then with respect to x. And so if you kind of look at it this way, this composition of the four functions, you can actually represent it with sort of this directed chain, right? So you start with x, you apply a, then you apply b, then you apply c, then you apply d. And if you do it this way, where you go from y with respect to c, then b, then a, you are sort of going backwards. So you started with the derivative with respect to c, then you go to b, then you go to a, then you go get to x, and this is effectively backprop. And what I wanted to kind of say is that backprop is the most popular way of doing this, but you can also go the other way. The order of multiplication, actually, it's up to you. Backprop becomes, and it's So if it's a chain kind of a situation, this is sort of, I don't know where, like, there's sort of a very classic dynamic programming problem of like when you're multiplying matrices, like when you're multiplying a chain of matrices, what order you want to multiply them to reduce to have the minimal amount of computation. So you can prove that if it's a chain, you can solve this through a DP. And if it's a chain and the output is a scalar, like it's just like a loss scalar, then roughly a backprop is probably your best bet. And I think you can kind of show that. And so that's why that became kind of popular. But with more sort of generalized computations. So if you have like a directed acyclic graph, for example, then sort of all bets are off. It's actually unclear what is the fastest way of computing the derivative of y with respect to x. And this is actually, so what I wanted to just give a little bit of flavor here is that this is an active area of research when it comes to automatic differentiation. It's unclear. If you look at all of the ML popular packages, they generally give a backprop solution, but they also have various different ways of doing things as well, because it's not really a clearly solved problem anyway. So that's a little bit of a segue. But in order to do automatic differentiation, you roughly need two things. One is that if you have, say, a loss in terms of weights, you want to break down your function into a set of constituent functions, this DCBA, for example. So you need to know how f is composed. Like, how do you go from weights to loss? Like, what is the series of functions that were applied to get to loss? And then you need a gradient definition for each one of these intermediate functions so that you can then, let's, for the sake of this thing, just say you can backprop through it and get it done. Does this roughly make sense? Okay. So those are like the two things you need. All right. So that's just some background on like how you implement automatic differentiation, and then we'll kind of come back to this when we start getting into the details of certain of these things. So I wanted to also kind of start with this distinction between compiled and interpreted languages. I think you're probably aware of this. Like, you take a language like C, C++, you have a compiler, it gets to like a machine intermediate representation, and then you can then execute that to get your output. And so you kind of compile blobs of code to get to a blob of machine IR, and then you can get an output from it. An interpreted language like Python, you can kind of line by line execute it, and then you're getting output as you go. So compiled languages tend to be very performant because you know of a blob, you can apply some compiler passes and optimize it to do better things. It's easier to deploy because this machine IR typically tends to be agnostic of a lot of things. Like, it can be a general form that doesn't depend on it typically will depend on the assembler and like the low level kind of stuff, but you can still abstract it away to some extent. Interpreted languages tend to be a lot more flexible because you're getting line by line results, and then they're a lot more debuggable because you're getting instant feedback. So with that kind of background, I want to kind of view the two popular frameworks as these with these differences. Like, so at least TensorFlow 1 versus say PyTorch. And so TensorFlow 1, when it came out 5 something years ago, it had a huge sort of focus on deployment. TensorFlow 1 was built for large scale ads and search systems within Google. And it was absolutely necessary that you could deploy this in a production environment. And production environments don't run Python, at least at Google. Like they all want sort of C++ and things like that. So you could train in whatever you want to, but you need to be able to execute the thing in C++. And so you need to be able to deploy it. And there were a bunch of sort of compiler folks, and like depending on like the kind of people who also built it. So TensorFlow 1 was very much like a compiled language. So the idea was that you have this Python front end, and then this Python front end produces a graph, which is like your compiled machine IR, which is completely language independent. And so the interesting kind of weird thing about it is the compilation of the Python stuff that you've written is not like a traditional compiler. It actually compiles it into this IR, this graph, by interpreting the Python thing. So what do I kind of mean by that? So you execute each line of Python code as you're going along to build this graph. So when I get a constant, when I run this constant function, like when I'm running tf.constant, the execution of it adds a node to the graph. And then so I create another constant, I add another node, I have an add. So now this creates an add. And so in the middle, there is sort of this graphical representation, but on the right side, this is what the graph looks like. So there's a constant node, there's another constant node, there's an add node, which has these two things as input. And so this is your graph IR that you end up with. This is a protocol buffer, which works across language, it is transportable. It can be understood in any language. You could give it to C++, Python, whatever. It'll Java, Go, whatever. You can read this thing. And so then you and one kind of thing here is that, like, if I look at A, B, or C here, these things won't make much sense to you, like, because these are not actual values. This is some handle to something in the graph somewhere, because I haven't run the thing yet, right? Till you session run it, you don't get anything. So what this kind of allows you to do is graph optimization. So I have like a very dumb optimization here, Vic. So suppose I was running this thing 1,000 times. I'm adding two constants. I know this graph, right? Like, so I know I'm adding these two constants. I know what the output of this thing is. I really don't need to compute this thing again and again. So if I'm running this 1,000 times, I just don't need to do this add operation. I can just return you the result because I know what graph there is. Similarly, there are lots of other kind of things you can do, right? Where if I'm doing say, for some reason, if I'm taking the square root of a square, I can see that I don't need to do those two operations. I can collapse that into just returning x back. Like you can do arithmetic. It's just standard kind of compiler tricks you can do.
Rohan, there is a question here. Arshdeep is asking why protobuf and not a JSON.
Yeah. So, well, it's just Google, right? Like we use protobufs for everything. So I think that's mostly. I really don't think we use JSON in many places. Yeah, I don't think we really use JSON at Google at all. Like this is very Google oriented. Like we use protobufs for everything. Internally.
I read something about it, but like, is it like because it offers some optimizations compared to JSON? And
it's a lot more compact, right? Like over the wire, it is very, very compact. I think JSON is sort of language agnostic, but that's fine, but it might not be the most efficient way of with regards to amount of bytes used. So protobuf is a lot more compressed that way. So other kind of benefits you get is you get like this is built with deployment in mind. So like this graph IR is all you care. Like at the end of the day, this is the program, this is the thing you want to execute. This graph IR is a protobuf. This can be used in any server. You can, whatever, Java, C++, whatever you want to, you have a server and you can do. You can have whatever front end that produces this thing. It doesn't matter. Python is just an instance. We had like TensorFlow Go front ends, Java front ends, JavaScript front ends. So it doesn't really matter what the front end is. All that matters is what graph you ended up producing. So it allows a lot of people in different languages to kind of author things pretty easily. And then the third thing is that like from sort of the automatic gradient, automatic differentiation part, it is like you need to know like when you got to your loss, what were the things you did from your weights to get there. And you have all that information in the graph, right? Because when you look at the loss, you can, in the graph, you can see, oh, which node produced the loss. And then I can walk the graph back up and I can get that entire expression that I need, right? Like, so doing automatic differentiation or gradient computation is like really, really easy because you already have the graph to do this. So now we get into the parts where this becomes tricky. So what if you want to do control flow? So like you have an if statement. I've put like these placeholder things which allow you to give you inputs later on. So you just say like, I have A and I have B. I don't know what the values are, but I will provide them to you later on at runtime. So like when I run C, I give the values of A and B. And so then this program works. Now, what I want to kind of do is to say like, oh, if the first element of A is 1, I want to add A and B, but otherwise I want to multiply A and B. And so this kind of depends on the input, and I don't know which branch I'm going to take. So if I want to convert this into a graph, I need to actually encode this logic into the graph, right? Because I don't know what A is. At least when I'm producing the graph. Does that make sense? And so then TensorFlow comes up with like these conditional operators to allow you. So this is actually on the left-hand side is completely invalid code. This will not work. So you actually need to end up writing your code in these tfcond kind of ways. And so this now adds a conditional node in the graph, which switches based on this thing. But this has like a ridiculous amount of limitations because it cannot do everything that Python does. Python is absolutely nuts when it comes to these things because like you could return something like a completely different. You can do like exception-based control flow where like you try something, if it fails, then you try something else. There's no way you can encode any of this thing in a graph. So there is only a limited amount of things you can put into a graph. The second thing, which is kind of tough, is like debugging. Because you're deferring the computation, so like you're building this graph and then running the graph, when there is a problem, then the graph is probably transformed multiple times, it's kind of really hard to go from when it is getting executed to your actual code that you wrote in the first place. So we did like a bunch of work to kind of make this better, but at the end of the day, you have these giant stack traces that like, for a lot of people don't make any sense. And it's like, this is one of the kind of simpler cases, but there are lots of other places where it kind of becomes a pretty hard thing to debug. So with these kind of limitations, right, like the amount of dynamicism you can get with the control flow and sort of the debugging sort of problem, the natural sort of pivot was towards kind of interpreter style programming for ML frameworks, and which is kind of what PyTorch really kind of was the leader in. And so in PyTorch, it's similar to NumPy, where like there's no graph. You just execute things as you go. So if I create a tensor, I have a tensor, and then if I do a plus b, you have 7 plus 5, 7, 9. You can do whatever Python control flow you want to. You don't have cons. You don't have anything of that sort. So this is like, it gives you as much dynamicism you want, and the motivation was also that I think there was a class of models at that point of time which was also required this level of dynamicism. And then when sort of transformers and other things came along, it kind of became obsolete. But it's still a big win for debuggability at the very least. But now the kind of question is, I don't know when I end up with a loss, what was the series of operations I ended up with? So how do you solve the automatic differentiation problem, right? Because if I have a bunch of weights and then I did a bunch of things on them and then I end up with a loss, how do I backprop? And so you need to do this graph or tape thing to be able to do that. So what PyTorch does under the hood is, when you say like, I have a torch.tensor and I require a gradient with respect to it, it starts a tape. So whatever operations you chain onto A, as you go along, it will start recording it they call it a tape. It's very similar to a graph. But there is one sort of very important difference here. TensorFlow. So if I have this style of code where I have kind of different inputs and I'm running this computation again and again, TensorFlow will construct one graph and then you just are calling session on run with different inputs again and again. What PyTorch does is it actually traces this tape or graph every time you execute. So if I'm iterating in a loop over A and B and I have this kind of a control flow, sometimes A of 0 is 1, sometimes it's not. Sometimes I take this branch, sometimes I take the other branch. The time, suppose the first time I took the first branch, actually I will not even look at the other one, and then my tape will only have A plus B on it. And then when I do C dot backward, I go backpropping through this add operator. If the next time it was not, I have this stack thing that I'm doing, then I'm going to backprop through this thing. So every time you go through this for loop, you're going to create a tape, go backward on the tape, then destroy that tape, and then go back and again. And so what this does is, you actually don't need to encode these control flow operations on your graph or tape. You can just rely on what Python does. It is definitely a huge hit to performance in some sense, because you are doing this tape construction thing again and again. But PyTorch has it's pretty amazing how good performance they can get even with these kind of limitations. It's like super well optimized on this thing, and I'm like actually amazed and impressed by their sort of performance culture.
Hey, Rohan, do you know of the reasons why PyTorch is able to extract performance? Is it because of vectorized operations? Like what?
Everybody does vectorized operations.
Yeah.
So what PyTorch does is they're sort of the amount of time in any ML framework, especially in code like this, the place where you're the slowest is Python, because Python is absolutely shit when it comes to performance, right? What PyTorch has done is the amount of time they spend in Python is so low. Like every line of PyTorch code is wrapped in sort of C++ very, very quickly. So like when I do this A plus B, the amount of Python stuff that I'm going through is very minimal. And so you get into C++ really, really quickly. And that's the thing that they've done really well. And compared to sort of TensorFlow, which has layers and layers of Python before you end up with C++.
But they still use Cython, right? As the so it's okay. So
no, but you can. So Cython, the nice thing about Cython is that you can just rip out you can rip out modules in Cython and write them with your own implementation. Like you can replace it completely with your own thing.
I see.
So there's no difference between like the Python sort of thing versus if you wrote your own custom thing. So you can actually, it's very hackable, and you can actually get pretty good performance. We actually did something with TensorFlow as well, and we were able to match them, but yeah, it's a big effort on our end to switch. So the one thing this doesn't solve though is still deployment, right? So if I wrote this thing, and if I had this giant kind of loop of going through an entire data set, there's no way I can record the entire thing and the unrolled loop and deploy things, right? So when you deploy, you actually want something like a TensorFlow graph, which you can then, you give it multiple inputs and then you keep running it. And so you end up with the requirement for a compiled language independent IR. And so for the most time, PyTorch didn't really care about this, because PyTorch really didn't focus on deployment much. Like they just cared about training and producing the best model. And then they used to rely on things like Onyx or whatever to convert them to something which is more deployable. And so there wasn't really much of native PyTorch deployment. And so this is a more recent thing. So their sort of solution is TorchScript. The approach PyTorch takes to producing this IR is also a bit different than the way, say, TensorFlow approaches this. So TorchScript, so in TensorFlow, you do what you call trace compilation, where like when I execute the constant, I add the node to the graphs, but I'm executing that constant Python code. What PyTorch does is it takes a blob of Python, and then you can actually look at it as an abstract syntax tree. So like I have this example kind of here, like you have A equal to 1, B equal to 2. So this is like, if I look at this Python thing, I'm just looking at the source code. This source code can be represented as a tree, and then it just takes this tree and transforms it to something. So you never run the Python code ever. So you could literally kind of think of this as like, I have a program which takes in a text file of Python code as input, and then I can produce a text file of IR as output without the Python interpreter or without running Python. It's a bit of a different style of getting to this representation compared to a TensorFlow. The downside is it's a little more restrictive, because there is only so much you can understand from a syntax tree without really running it, especially with how dynamic Python can be. But it tends to be faster, and then it's pretty clear. Like you can have pretty clean semantics on like what you want to support and what you can't support. So anyways, this is a bit of a difference I want to kind of point out. So both these kinds have some advantages and some disadvantages. The interpreter style is very like lightweight. It's kind of very flexible and kind of easy to play around with, but it's a bit challenging when it comes to deployment and even at like PyTorch. When you get to like very large scale programs, then TensorFlow tends to do a little better as well, because the compiler optimizations and other things kind of really help you then. So you have these now, and so PyTorch has evolved also to like doing more compilation as well. So now every framework is somewhat a hybrid. So you kind of mix and match. So you can have like this very straightforward kind of interpreted code here, but then you wrap things as TF functions, and these become like the original graphs. And so this stuff gets compiled, whereas the other stuff is interpreted. And so like you have this kind of mix and match. And so the idea is kind of like you mostly do your interpretation, but like when you come to a piece of code which is very performance sensitive or critical, you compile it. And then it becomes faster. And then once you're kind of done, you can only deploy these compiled artifacts. So like you need to be able to compile your entire thing later on when you want to deploy. So that's kind of the idea behind TensorFlow 2. And then there's JAX, which is another kind of hybrid framework. JAX, with respect to sort of TensorFlow 2, has a couple of, so JAX was built primarily by researchers at Google, and they tend to be very, close to math, and so they wanted their code to look very much like math. So they have, like, every framework is close to NumPy, but JAX is probably the closest when it comes to actual semantics. It's purely functional. So what that means is there are no stateful objects in their paradigm. So like you can't like assign like A of 0 equal to 1. That doesn't work. And then all your code, because everything's a function, it looks very much like math. So the gradient thing is also like an operator. Like you have a function and then you take a grad, so that gives you like a gradient function which you can then apply to a value. So it looks like their sort of idea was I could take a math paper and then write it in JAX and it shouldn't look very different. The other sort of thing was, different accelerators have different sort of trade-offs. So like things such as TPUs are a bit restrictive to really get the performance that they get. You have to always compile things. There's no kind of interpretation on a TPU really. And then it doesn't handle dynamic shapes. So like basically you need to know the shape of everything that you are executing. And so JAX is, because it was built at Google and for research at Google, which is typically done all on TPUs, they have heavily indexed to TPUs. So like they have pretty bad experience on things like GPUs, but they're brilliant on TPUs. So yeah, I think mostly that's all I had.